Okay, welcome back, guys. So we're moving on to the next section. We left off the end of part one, Montag and Mildred at home, the hound kind of sniffing around outside of their house. Beatty's left, and Montag is trying to read this book and understand it. But they can't understand, they don't know how to really read and interpret and think critically, which leads us into part two. And again, we want to think about titles. Title of a section obviously can be an important thing. In this case, it's the sieve and the sand. So what do these represent? And what's the importance of this that they're going to call this section the sieve and the sand? So a sieve is something you pour through. It's kind of like a filter. So you might think of, you're making some pasta and the pasta's ready and you've got your pasta noodles and you're going to pour it into this strainer, which has all these little holes in it. Okay, so it's like a strainer. So whatever I pour into the strainer, something's going to come out of these holes underneath. In this case, if I put my, spaghetti or something, whatever, there's spaghetti, okay, into this, the water's going to pour out. Okay, so it can only partially hold something inside. And if you imagine it's sand you're pouring in here and not pasta, well, sand is going to be pouring right through these holes. Barely anything is going to be held because sand is very, very fine. There's lots of it. Many, you can think of bits of information being like the sand. Okay, so it can have density and weight when you add a lot of sand. Like sand on its own, it's very fine, it's very small. But if you take, a big truck full of it, it's very heavy and hard to transport. So what is the sieve then? And what is the sand? The sieve is symbolic of the mind. And so the sand is going to be symbolic of knowledge or information. And right now, Montag's mind is especially weak and vulnerable, and it's very difficult for him to retain any information in his mind because he's never read a book before, he's never been taught how to read, to interpret, to analyze, to ask questions, and so on. Okay, so this sieve, well, it's not going to hold much at this point. Even if he reads, he can't understand. So understanding is part of keeping, which has to do with retention. It's one thing to read something, it's another to remember what you read, and it's still another thing to understand what you read, to retain the knowledge. You might be able to memorize facts, okay, that's fine. But can you interpret the facts? Can you do something with them? Can you have application? Can you have any kind of critical analysis? And so what we're going to get in this section is Montag and Mildred sitting around in the house, and he's trying to read the books and figure out, like, what's so important in these books that lady would die for her books, that Clarice McClellan and her family seemed so different and so happy compared to his dead mausoleum tomb-like home. So they read the long afternoon through while the cold November rain fell from the sky upon the quiet house. They sat in the hall because the parlor was so empty and gray-looking, without its walls lit with orange and yellow confetti and skyrockets and women in gold mesh dresses and men in black velvet, pulling 100-pound rabbits from silver hats. The parlor was dead, and Mildred kept peering in at it with a blank expression as Montag paced the floor, came back and squatted down and read a page as many as 10 times aloud. We cannot tell the precise moment when friendship is formed. As in filling a vessel drop by drop, there is at last a drop which makes it run over. So in a series of kindnesses, there is at last one which makes the heart run over. Montag sat listening to the rain. Notice they can't understand. He sometimes has to read the same page 10 times. And still, it's like sand that he can't hold in this sieve. It's just draining out. He can't understand. He can't hold on to that information. Notice the personification language. The personification of the parlor. So personification, giving human qualities to non-human things. In this case, the parlor can't be dead. It's not really alive. But to Mildred, it feels dead because she thinks of the parlor as her family. Okay, so we can't cover everything in this next section. I'm going to breeze by some of it. But again, Montag has in mind Clarice, girl next door. He's trying to figure out what was different about her. And as he reads the books, he's thinking about her. Mildred doesn't care, though. And then there's something outside the door, scratching around. There's the smell of blue electricity. So the hound is prowling around outside the house. Clearly they know there's books inside the house. Mildred, however, doesn't really care. She says, books aren't people. You read and I look around, but there isn't anybody. So she sees people as her parlor family. She sees them as alive. But in books, she can't relate. And we get a little bit more about the war background on page 69, and a little bit more detail. We're not going to go into all Mildred and Montag's back and forth. It's pretty clear what Mildred's all about. Mildred is a static character. She doesn't change. And so she only has one view about the books, and she's not going to change, even though Montag is talking about it. So he mentions we've started and won 2 atomic wars since 1960 as the bombers cross the sky over their house. So there's always tons of huge bomber planes going by, and apparently there's been 2 atomic wars. So now we know atomic war is the background of the dystopia, of this particular dystopia. And so why did the atomic wars happen? The result of what Beatty described as the cultural shift led to that, which was don't offend anybody and cater to the minorities and be anti-intellectual, have, comic books and porn, basically. And what ended up happening was they, destroy books and destroy society. Leads to war with other nations who didn't want to be like that. All right, so in the next section, I'm just going to point out a couple things quickly. We get a bit of a background in page 70 of Montag's first meeting with Faber. So he shuts his eyes and he says, yes, of course. He found himself thinking of the Green Park a year ago. Thought I'd been with him many times recently, but now he remembered how it was that day in the city park when he had seen that old man in the black suit hide something quickly in his coat. And what would that have been? Most likely a book. And who's the old man? It's actually Faber. And we'll see that the next section, this part 2, Faber is going to be a key character as a guide, as a teacher, as a thinker, and a historian. And he's going to be a mentor to Montag. He's going to teach him how to think, how to read and interpret, to understand the meaning in books. Okay, so actually Montag already encountered Faber, and he's remembering back. The old man leapt up as if to run, and Montag said, "Wait! No one said you did." "I haven't done anything," cried the old man, trembling. "No one said you did." They had sat in the green soft light without saying a word for a moment. Then Montag talked about the weather, and then the old man responded with a pale voice. It was a strange, quiet meeting. The old man admitted to being a retired English professor who had been thrown out upon the world 40 years ago when the last liberal arts college shut for lack of students and patronage. So 40 years ago, no more liberal arts colleges, no more students. So universities start closing. There's no need for them if you're not studying books and literature. A liberal arts education is, English, humanities, history, philosophy, and nobody's studying that stuff anymore. His name was Faber, and when he finally lost his fear of Montag, he talked in a cadenced voice, looking at the sky and trees in the Green Park. And when an hour had passed, he said something to Montag, and Montag sensed it was a rhymeless poem. Then the old man grew even more courageous, said something else that was a poem too. Faber held out his hand over the left coat pocket and spoke these words gently. Montag knew if he reached out, he might pull a book of poetry from the old man's coats, but he did not reach out. His hand stayed on his knees, numbed and useless. "I don't talk things, sir," said Faber. "Talk the meaning of things."